You've been circling around something I wanted to ask when we lost the connection, Jack, which was just around what it would look like in a world of decriminalization to have a group working together under some sort of accreditation. You use the example of babysitters and how you can pay somebody to babysit your child. And I immediately thought, well, what about daycares where daycare workers are often like professionally trained, credentialed? There is usually some form of government oversight to keep things safe. I'm curious if there is any space for a hybrid model, whether one that involves like government regulation of like people who opt in to that type of program, or even just a like third party outside accreditation board that sort of oversees things and perhaps certifies things. Is there any value in that sort of model? Would you see that working well, or is there perhaps an issue I'm not seeing here?
Yeah, I think when we imagine like someone being accredited in this way, we would have to talk about what they would be accredited in. If you're being accredited in sex, who judges how good you are at sex? Who judges how like what training would you have in terms of like interacting with clients, in terms of what sexual stuff you're providing? What, like, how would that work? Because mostly I hear about this as being like a form of therapy, essentially, right? When we get down to it, is people talking about providing this kind of like controlled intimacy for the benefit of people. So people who have never had sex before, who are really nervous, and they go to a sex worker and they have sex for the first time, and by seeing a sex worker work through some of that, right? The problem with that I see is that we already have therapists as a group that exists, right? And if someone told me that their therapist tried to have sex with them, or that their therapist was suggesting that, we would see that as a massive boundary cross, right? That would be deeply inappropriate. If you went to therapy with just a random therapist that you found online, and while you're in therapy, you're talking about like you have sexual trauma and you really struggle with sex, and they said, we should have sex to fix that, you'd be like, that's fucked up. And even if someone was advertising that way, they wouldn't be permitted to, because we recognize that there's kind of like a boundary crossing in terms of who's providing you therapy and someone you're having intimacy with, in the same way that we tend not to have doctors performing surgery on people that they are like romantically involved with, or their children, because it affects how they give the therapy, or like how they perform surgery on them, their nervousness. I think when you have people seeing sex workers for this kind of like crossover with therapy, like, no, you can go and see a therapist who's already accredited to talk about your sexual issues, and they'll give you advice about what to go home and do with your partner. Having the person giving you the advice be the same person who's having sex with you, there is a massive conflict of interest, because part of sex work is pretending that you're enjoying having sex with the person. But now you're not doing that because you're providing them therapy, or you're teaching them how to perform sex acts. And if you pretend you enjoy it, you're kind of like defeating the point, right? Sure. Of that, like, you aren't teaching them anything if you're pretending your enjoyment. And now you have this kind of like, I can't see that working without some kind of conflict of interest. And if we're not talking about like certifying someone in being good at sex, which is what most people are paying sex workers for, is literally just the physical act of sex. They're not really even seeking intimacy, they're just seeking the physical act there. Then we're not going to be able to certify people in that without there being a whole problem with the certification board and the kind of people on it and the ethics of that. And if we're talking about therapy, I think people you have sex with and people you get therapy from should be separate people.
Sure. No, and there have been programs with sexual surrogates and various things in the States in the past. They've been largely shuttered, and I'd be very curious to see what that could look like. But it does feel very far away as we're talking about, you know, universal basic income and widespread federal decriminalization. It seems like a bridge several steps away.